guys, so today we're going to be talking about the second half of the Vietnam study sheet by looking at kind of the way that the war was fought, some of the major incidents involved. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the two kind of major strategies of the war. So the first for the Americans is to kind of wear down the Vietcong. Basically, we recognize that they are not a formalized army, a formalized unit, and so we kind of want to increase the body count, right? Like knock them off, as many of them as we can. Get at the hearts and minds is kind of the phrase that you'll often hear at the Vietcong, and kind of like wear them down so they get tired of fighting. Next thing we do are search and destroy missions. So this is what I was talking about, how it's kind of hard to find out who the Vietcong are. Basically going into different villages and trying to like figure out who's Vietcong and who's not, and get rid of the ones who are, that sort of idea. And then finally we use something called napalm or Agent Orange from airstrikes. So these are both chemical warfares. Napalm causes a massive explosion. Agent Orange is like part of a pesticide and kind of wipes out the jungle and that sort of area. They both have pretty terrible effects on the people that are involved. So just for example, this is a person who's been infected by Agent Orange. You can see it causes, body disfiguration and that sort of thing. So basically, we're just trying to weed them out, right? In terms of the Viet Cong, what they use are mostly guerrilla tactics. They ambush American soldiers from the jungle, attack, wipe out as many as they can, then retreat. They used a series of really intricate tunnels that are nicknamed the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which they dug underground. That basically you could survive underground, but they're hard to find. And so essentially the Viet Cong could quite literally pop up out of the ground and attack the American troops above and then disappear back under the ground before we even know where they came from. They used also a lot of booby traps and landmines, because you got to remember, these guys know the jungles and the forests better than we do, so they are taking advantage of their home field advantage, right? So this is just a picture of what a Ho Chi Minh Trail might look like. So you can see literally everything they need. Kitchen, small little places where smoke can come out, ventilation shafts, a fire station that's power generated, bunks for them to stay. This is one of a snake trap, which is a booby trap. So you go the wrong way, you get into that. You can see what I said, that they can just kind of pop up out of the ground and fire and pop right back in. You see more booby traps that are around. And so basically this made it really hard to find these guys, right? And so after a while, this is really going to cause a lot of low morale in the American troops. As I said before, it's hard to know who the enemy really is, and they're a hard enemy to fight. You don't have to write this quote down, but this is a great example of what I think is going on. So we marched into the rice paddies. We carried along with our packs and rifles the implicit convictions that the Viet Cong could be quickly beaten. We kept the packs and the rifles. The conviction we lost, right? So just some reasons that we have here. There is a lot of corruption and instability in the South Vietnam government. The treatment of POWs is just really, really bad. And so that's going to cause a major problem. There's also, most of these guys are very young. The average age of a Vietcong soldier or Vietnam soldier is about 19. And a lot of them were put on several years of duty. That's a really long time to be out in the jungle fighting this enemy away from home. There is a draft. However, a lot of the draft was seen as kind of unfair. For example, if you were in college, at least at the beginning of the war, you could be exempt. There's also not a lot of support at home. And when I say there's not support, I don't mean just support for the war itself, but there's also not a lot of support for the troops. That's something that's very different from today, right? But that is a big part of what was going on. There was unequal treatment amongst the troops of white and black soldiers. So especially for African Americans, this caused a lot of low morale. And this is going to lead to a lot of drug and alcohol abuse throughout the troops. It also leads to fragging the officers, where basically this lower troops would treat their officers badly. They kind of blamed the officers, and sometimes they would beat or even kill the officers to make it look like an accident. So make it kind of look like, that happened in the heat of battle, but really it was the old men that had done it to them. So for some of the reasons that the support for the war starts to waver at home, the first is the economy. The economy starts to go down pretty big. Inflation is high. Because of this, Johnson's Great Society suffers. Congress reduces the amount of money to the Great Society by $6 billion, making it harder for it to work.
Miss Waiver or Mr. Thompson, could you call the front office, please?
The second problem that we have is television, or causes support to waver is television. So a lot of times this war gets nicknamed the living room war, and that's because basically it is the first war where the media shows exactly what's going on, right? It's the first war where we can see firsthand exactly what it's about. We get a nightly body count. We see images of soldiers, of, battles and things like this. And we're really seeing what kind of war this is and how hard war really is. The problem is there's what's called a credibility gap, where basically the government says we're winning and the TV says we are losing. And everything that's on the TV looks a lot more like we're losing than what the government's saying. So this means that we're going to stop supporting the government. The credibility gap means that there is a gap of what the government's telling us and what we're seeing, right? So we're saying that the government is no longer credible. No longer, we can't believe the government anymore. The next thing that we've got is the My Lai massacre. So the My Lai massacre was a U.S. search and destroy mission that kind of went haywire. We went into a village hoping to track down some Vietcong. Things got out of hand. Over 100 women and children were killed in this village. It kind of fuels the war protest at home. People at home start saying like, oh, look at what the troops are doing. They're killing innocent people. And this is an unjust, unfair war, right? The next thing that there is some draft dodging that goes on, where basically people are trying to get out of the draft. The draft is huge. Over 300,000 men are sent by Johnson alone into this conflict. Many are moving out of the country. Some go to Canada. They burn their draft card, which is a felony, by the way, and start to kind of do whatever they can to get out of being drafted. Then, of course, there are massive protests all over the country. So people are starting to hold these rallies and protests against the war, but again, not just against the war, against the soldiers. And remember, a lot of these soldiers had been drafted, did not choose to go. The hippie movement plays a big role in the protest movement, as well as a lot of student organizations, such as Students for a Democratic Society, that were the SDS. There's also a movement called the Free Speech Movement and the New Left. So these are people who do not support Johnson. Okay, so Johnson, remember, is a Democrat, but these are Democrats who are saying, like, Johnson got us into this conflict and he's lying about everything and we don't support Johnson, so we're the new left, right? The protests really come to a head at Kent State, where the ROTC building is attacked at Kent State. So the ROTC are, cadets in training. When the ROTC building is set on fire, the National Guard is called in and fires into the crowd. 2 people are killed. 1 was an innocent bystander. And this, got on national news, and it really left a really sour taste in people's mouth, saying, like, this is what's going on overseas, and the same thing's happening here at home. They're, killing us all over the place. And the war really loses a lot of support. Now, this is not on a place on your notes, but you do need to add this too. There also is a movement because of this of people who are opposed to people who are opposed to the war. So they are war opposition, right? So these are people who not necessarily support the war, some of them do, but are saying that we should at least support the United States. So Dubs versus Hawks. Dubs are people who support peace, so that would be like the hippie movement. Hawks is the nickname to people who are supporting the war. You would hear things like America, love it or leave it. Like, you don't want to be a part of it? Go to Canada. We don't want you anymore anyway, right? A lot of these are like blue-collar workers, the average American, that sort of thing. So that's kind of some people who do try to kind of fight back against the war opposition. The next reason that U.S. support waivers is the Tet Offensive. So the Tet Offensive was an action that took place in the Vietnamese New Year on Tet. Okay, so a truce is called so that the South can bury their dead. There's a big ceremony that goes on that day, and so we say we're going to stop fighting. We'll let you have your holiday to bury those who are lost, right? However, At the same time this happens, the Vietcong simultaneously surprise attack all of the major cities in South Vietnam. It is a massive, almost a massacre. The U.S. troops do kind of fight them back, but it takes a long time, and we almost don't. It's definitely a big moral defeat where people are saying, like, you know, this is just going to this makes the war just seem impossible to win. Like, this just proved that this war is impossible, right? Finally, we have the election of 1968 in the Democratic Convention. So LBJ announces in 1968 that he is not going to run for re-election in 1968. So the Democrats have to choose a new candidate. There are a lot of people who are up for it. Robert Kennedy is one of those people. However, on his campaign, he was assassinated in California when he shot in a hotel. At the Democratic Convention, a riot breaks out, led by a group called the Chicago 8. So these were some protesters who caused a riot at the Democratic Convention. And basically, the Democrats look like they're not able to control anything. Between Johnson lying about the war and Democrats are not even able to control their own party, much less a bigger conflict. People really just see this as a massive failure, right? So the Democrats do not win the election. Richard Nixon, a Republican, will be elected on the promise that he's going to get us out of the conflict. After this happens, there is a release of a set of papers known as the Pentagon Papers. And when they come out, it kind of showed that there were some plans leaked that Johnson was making plans to enter Vietnam even when he was promising not to send troops. So he was already kind of planning for the war even before the Tonkin Gulf incident. And this just makes Democrats look really bad. It shows the government had not been honest. And basically everybody's pissed, right? By the end of this war, everybody is angry. So when Nixon inherits the war and comes to power, he's got some new policies that he's going to try and get us out of it as quickly as possible. The first one he calls is the Vietnamization policy. So basically what he's doing, this is led by his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, where we want to make peace with honor. Right? And the way to do that is to gradually withdraw U.S. troops so that the South Vietnamese who were fighting with us can kind of take over. So we're making the war a Vietnam war instead of an American Vietnam war, right? The second thing that he does is the invasion of Cambodia. This takes place in December of 1969, where basically U.S. troops invade Cambodia to cut off the supply lines to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They start bombing Cambodia on Christmas. This does cause protest on college campuses. Over 1.5 million students closed down almost 1,200 campuses. And then in the final push of 73, the bombing campaign is increased to cut off the North Vietnamese until finally in 1973, U.S. troops, or 74, I guess it should say, U.S. troops leave Vietnam. Were completely withdrawn. Nixon pulls us all out. He promises the South that if the North invades, we will resume bombing. However, the capital of Saigon falls in March of 75. Anybody that had been left in the capital is pulled out. We provide economic aid, but no troops. South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam, and Vietnam becomes a communist country. So we'll talk more in class about kind of the effects and legacies of the war and what it really meant. But this is just a really quick overview, the basics of what you need to know, and we'll get more into this kind of stuff in class. So I will see you soon. Bye-bye.